The silver blade was already at Corvin Rosencrux's throat when Dahlia Fairchild threw herself between him and the assassin. She did not hesitate. She did not calculate the odds. She simply moved, placing her body between 6 feet of ancient vampire predator and the hooded figure who had pressed a stake carved from white ash against Corvin's pale neck with enough force to draw a thin line of black-red blood. Her medical bag hit the marble floor of the underground court with a hollow crack. Both hands came up, empty, palms forward, and her voice came out steady despite the fact that her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. "Stop," she said. "If you kill him, you destroy the only bridge between the Blood Court and the human alliance. You will start a war that burns both worlds to the ground. Think before you do something that cannot be undone." The assassin's hood fell back. Pale silver eyes, sharp cheekbones, the telltale white hair braided tight against a skull that had not aged in 4 centuries. Vampire, court-born, by the look of the crest stitched into the collar of his coat. Corvin's hand closed around Dahlia's wrist from behind. His grip was iron. His voice dropped to something low and lethal that she had only heard from him twice before, both times when something had threatened her life. "Move aside, Dahlia. No, this is not your fight. You're bleeding," she said without turning around eye. "That makes it my business." The assassin's silver eyes moved between them. Something shifted in his expression, not hesitation exactly, but recalculation. In the 3 seconds of silence that followed, Dahlia counted her options. She was a healer. She carried no weapon. The underground chamber of the Blood Court was sealed, the exits guarded by 6 of Corvin's sentinels who were apparently not fast enough to have prevented this ambush, which meant whoever had sent this man had allies inside, which meant the betrayal went deeper than anyone had warned her. She had arrived at this court 6 weeks ago as a neutral party, a human healer brought in under ancient treaty to treat the Regent while his own physicians argued over a poison no vampire apothecary could identify. She had not expected to still be here. She had certainly not expected Corvin Rosencrux. But here they were, and the man behind her was bleeding. And she was not moving. The assassin stepped back. Not in surrender, but in the particular way of someone choosing a better angle. Then Corvin moved. She had seen him move fast before, but never like this. He was past her, between her and the blade, and the white-haired assassin was pinned against the stone wall, with one hand at his throat, before the echo of movement had finished registering in the chamber. The stake clattered across the floor. 3 of Corvin's sentinels poured through the eastern door. A half-second later, which was, Dahlia noted with professional irritation, at least 4 seconds too late. Corvin did not look at her while he pressed the assassin into the wall. He looked at him. When he spoke, the regal cold in his voice was like a winter road, beautiful and absolutely lethal. "Who sent you?" It was not a question. Dahlia had first met Corvin Rosencrux exactly 43 days ago in the parking garage beneath St. Maron's Hospital at 11:37 on a Tuesday night. She had been on her way to her car after a 14-hour shift in the emergency department. Her sneakers were still damp from an incident involving a ruptured drainage bag, and she was thinking about nothing more complex than a bowl of cereal and approximately 8 hours of unconsciousness when a black car had pulled up beside her and a man had stepped out. He was the most striking person she had ever seen. White hair, not bleached, not styled, simply white, falling straight to his jaw with the kind of careless elegance that suggested it had always looked exactly like that. Pale skin that in the fluorescent light of the parking garage carried a faint luminous quality as though he were lit from somewhere slightly other than the overhead fixtures. Dark suit, immaculate. A silver crest pin at his lapel she did not recognize. He stood at least 6'2", and the way he held himself, still and absolutely certain in his own presence, made the surrounding concrete and parked cars look like a stage set built specifically for him. He said, "You are Dahlia Fairchild." Not a question, she would later note. He rarely asked questions when he already knew the answers. "Last time I checked," she said, because she was exhausted, and the hour was past the point where she filtered herself. "Who are you, and how do you know my name?" "Corvin Rosencrux," he said. "I represent the Blood Court of the Undivided Realm. We require your services. You are the foremost specialist on toxicological unknowns in the Northern Hemisphere. Our Regent has been poisoned with something your kind calls an unknown compound. My physicians cannot identify it. Yours can apparently, if the correct one is found. She stared at him for a moment, then she said the blood court, as in the vampire court. Yes, the secret one beneath the city, the one beneath the city, yes. I would prefer you not put the word secret immediately before it in future. She studied him for another moment. The parking garage hummed around them. A car passed on the level above. She was aware, in the practiced clinical way she had developed over years of emergency medicine, that she was not afraid. She probably should have been. She filed that observation away for later examination. Is the Regent dying? She asked. Something moved across his face. Something she would come to understand was the closest Corvin Rosencrux came to showing pain in company he had not yet decided to trust. Yes, he said, slowly, deliberately. Someone wants him to suffer before he goes. That, she said, picking up her bag from where she had set it on the hood of her car, is something I take personally. She looked at him. You'll need to tell me everything about the compound. Every symptom, every progression, every treatment that has already been attempted. I need full access and full honesty, or I cannot help him. He had looked at her then with an expression she could not name. Something between surprise and reassessment, the look of a person encountering something that did not match their predictions. You are not afraid, he said. I'm a doctor, she said. I deal with things that are trying to kill people. The source of the threat is less relevant than the threat itself. She paused. Also, if you meant me harm, you'd have done it already and not bothered with conversation. You're here because you need something. That gives me a certain amount of standing now. Are you going to take me to your court, or are we going to keep standing in a parking garage discussing the nature of fear? He had opened the car door for her without another word. She had gotten in. The court beneath the city was nothing like she had imagined, and entirely like it should have been. She descended in an elevator that required a blood-keyed palm panel to operate, into a world that occupied the entire substructure beneath 3 city blocks, carved from the bedrock over centuries, and decorated in the manner of someone who had genuine personal memories of when the Baroque was new. High-vaulted ceilings. Candlelight that flickered in sconces of hammered silver beside electric lights that the court seemed to use with a certain reluctant practicality, as though conceding to the modern era while reserving the right to consider it temporary. Stone walls hung with tapestries, a grand hall that could have seated 300, currently occupied by perhaps 40 vampire courtiers who had all gone utterly silent when she walked in. She had kept her eyes forward and her chin level. Corvin had walked beside her, not behind her, not ahead of her, directly beside her, and she would realize later that this placement was deliberate, that the court was watching, and that positioning himself equal to her was a statement, a declaration of the weight he was placing on her presence here. The Regent was an ancient vampire named Valdris Theroun, silver-haired and paper-thin in his illness, who lay in a room hung with blue damask and smelled, to her clinical nose, of something organic and wrong. She had spent 4 hours at his bedside that first night, asking questions, taking samples she would need to bring to her own lab equipment, which Corvin had arranged to have transported underground by the following morning, and running the standard progression analysis in her head, while the court watched from the doorway with the particular anxious stillness of people who understood death very well, and were facing a version of it they could not control. She had come back the next night, and the night after that Corvin had been present for all of it. He did not hover. That was the thing she noticed first. He gave her space to work, positioned himself where he could see both her and every entry point to the room, and was silent unless spoken to. But he was always there, always watching. Not her work specifically, though she was certain he tracked that too, but the room, the door, the corridor beyond, every person who came within 20 feet of where she stood. The first time one of the courtiers had approached her without being invited to, she had seen Corvin shift from stillness to absolute attention in the space between one breath and the next, a motion so subtle it was more a change in quality of presence than actual movement. The courtier had asked her a perfectly benign question about the Regent's prognosis. Corvin had not moved further. But the courtier had answered faster than the question required, and had excused himself with more haste than grace. She had waited until they were alone in the corridor to say, "You don't need to do that, you know." "Do what?" he said. Loom, menace. Whatever you were doing just now, I was standing still. You were standing still in a very specific way. He had looked at her for a moment. Then something at the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to one, the acknowledgement that a smile existed as a possibility. He was approaching too quickly, Corvin said. The court knows you are here under my protection. The enforcement of that protection is occasionally visible. Is that a fancy way of saying you were warning him off? Yes. She had shaken her head, but she had not told him to stop. Because despite herself, she had been aware that every time Corvin positioned himself between her and the unknown, a tension she carried in her shoulders, without always noticing, loosened incrementally. And she needed to be sharp for the Regent. She could not afford to spend energy on her own vigilance, so she had let Corvin be what he was, and turned back to her work, and tried not to think too carefully about how quickly the presence of one specific vampire had begun to feel like something she relied on. The poison had taken her 11 days to identify. It was a compound she had never encountered in human medicine because it did not occur in human medicine. It was derived from a plant that had gone extinct in 1743, cultivated specifically for the blood court's enemies, in what turned out to be a very old, very patient plan. The compound disrupted the cellular matrix that allowed vampire physiology to maintain its regenerative properties, breaking down the body's ability to sustain immortal tissue from the inside. For a vampire, it was exquisitely cruel. For a human chemist looking at it fresh, it was actually fascinating, which she had mentioned aloud to Corvin at 2 a.m. when the identification came through. Fascinating, he had repeated flatly. From a purely scientific perspective, she said. The Regent is dying from it. I know. I said it was fascinating, not pleasant. Understanding it is how I stop it. Is that distinction something we can agree on? He had looked at her with the particular look she was beginning to catalogue, the one where he was reassessing her again, as though she kept failing to fit neatly into whatever category he had initially placed her in. Yes, he said, the distinction is accepted. The antitoxin had taken another 9 days, not because the chemistry was beyond her, but because producing it required components that crossed between human pharmacology and what she was learning to recognize as vampire biological chemistry, and the intersection was genuinely new territory. She had worked longer hours than she probably should have. She had eaten the food the court provided, which was always exactly what she would have chosen herself, which meant someone had been paying attention to small details. She had not thought anyone was tracking. She had slept in the rooms they gave her, which were unexpectedly comfortable and smelled of old stone and cedar. And every morning when she woke, there was a guard at her door, rotating shifts, always one of Corvin's own sentinels. On the 14th day, she had asked him directly, "How long do you intend to keep a guard outside my room?" They were in the corridor after a late session with the Regent. The court was quiet. The candlelight made his white hair look like something carved from old ivory. "For as long as you remain here," he said. "You think someone will try to stop me from saving him? I think someone spent 3 centuries cultivating a poison to kill him. I think that someone has more patience than most, and I think that if your work succeeds, that someone will be motivated to remove the obstacle to their plan." He looked at her steadily. "You are the obstacle." She absorbed this. That's somewhat alarming when stated plainly. I prefer plainness to comfortable falsehood. So do I, actually. She paused. The guard. Is it strictly protective? Or is there also an element of making sure I don't leave with information about the court? He did not flinch. She had learned he did not flinch. Both, he said, initially. And now? The pause before his answer was barely perceptible. Now it is protective. She had nodded and gone to her room, and lain in the dark thinking about the word now and the particular weight he had placed on it. She administered the antitoxin on day 20. Valdris Theroun's recovery was not instant, because she had been honest with the court from the beginning that it would not be, but it was measurable, visible, and within 72 hours, he was sitting upright in bed and demanding briefings, which 2 of his senior advisors received with the visible relief of people who had braced themselves for the alternative for weeks. The court had gathered in the hall that evening. Corvin had stood at the Regent's right when Valdris addressed the assembly. He had looked across the room and found her where she stood near the back, And whatever passed across his face in that moment was not gratitude exactly, because gratitude implied a debt, and this felt older than that, more elemental than that. It was recognition, and she had felt it land somewhere in her chest and stay. She should have left after that. The work was done. There was no remaining clinical reason for her to be underground in the blood court of the undivided realm when she had patience and a practice and an above-ground life waiting. She had told herself she was staying to monitor the Regent's recovery, that it was medically irresponsible to leave without confirming the antitoxin's long-term effect. This was true. It was also not the whole truth, and she was too honest with herself to pretend otherwise for long. On the 28th day, Corvin had found her in the court's library at 3 in the morning. She was reading a treatise on vampire physiology from 1609, which she had found on a lower shelf and had not been able to put down because the author's observations about regenerative cellular function were both historically fascinating and directly relevant to her research. She had her feet tucked under her in the chair, her reading glasses on, a cup of tea going cold at her elbow. He had looked at her from the doorway for a moment before she noticed him. "You should be sleeping," he said. "You should knock." The door was open. She held up the treatise. "Do you know what this author understands about regenerative matrix theory that your current court physicians apparently don't? I know that it is 3 in the morning, Corvin. This is remarkable. The foundational misunderstanding in how your physicians approached the poison was right here, documented in 1609. If someone had simply cross-referenced this against the symptom progression, Dahlia." The way he said her name stopped her. Not sharp, not commanding, not the particular tone she had learned to recognize as Corvin Rosencrux operating in his official capacity as the court's sentinel. Something else. Her name in his mouth at 3 in the morning, in a candlelit library, sounded like he had been holding it carefully and had just set it down. She took her glasses off. "Yes," he crossed the room. Sat in the chair opposite her with the unhurried grace of someone who did not exist in the same relationship with time that she did, and for a moment simply looked at her. The candlelight caught his face. He was not young in any human sense of the word, she was aware of that. She did not know precisely how old he was. Old enough that the world she knew was less than a sentence in his history, and yet he looked at her with an attention so entirely present that past and future seemed irrelevant to it. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to understand that the question carries no obligation and no pressure. You may answer however you choose, and nothing between us or your standing in this court will be affected." She held very still. "Ask? When your work here is complete. When you have confirmed the Regent is recovered. When there is no remaining medical reason for your presence." He paused. "Will you leave?" She looked at him for a long moment. "That depends," she said carefully, "on whether there is a non-medical reason for me to stay." Another pause. Longer. "There is," he said, "if you want there to be." She set the treatise down. "Is this you being plain rather than offering comfortable falsehood?" Yes. She looked at his face in the candlelight. The pale perfection of it, the white hair, the dark eyes that had been watching the world long before her grandparents were born. She thought about the way he had opened a car door in a parking garage and told her the truth about the danger she was in. She thought about the guard at her door and the food chosen to her taste, and the way he positioned himself in rooms as though he had already assessed every threat and placed himself between her and all of them. She thought about the look on his face when the Regent sat upright and he had found her across the room. "I would need my things brought down," she said. "My proper lab equipment, not the portable set. If I'm going to continue working on vampire physiology, I need the full setup," he said. "I will have it arranged by tomorrow evening, and I want access to the full library, not just the approved section, done, and coffee, real coffee. Whatever your kitchen has been serving me is something made by someone who has been immortal. For so long they have forgotten what good coffee tastes like." The corner of his mouth moved, past the precursor. An actual smile, quiet and real and rare, and she understood instinctively that this was not something the court saw often. "I will speak to the kitchen personally," he said. 6 more weeks had passed. They were the weeks that changed everything. She came to know him in the particular way that proximity and honesty build not through dramatic confession, but through accumulation. The way he read, sitting very still for hours, turning pages with a precision that suggested complete attention. The way he spoke to his sentinels, giving orders without cruelty, expecting excellence and acknowledging it when it appeared. The way he stood at the edge of a room at court gatherings and watched with the patience of someone who had seen the same politics cycle through different faces for centuries and found it no less important for being familiar. She came to know his honor. The code he lived by was old, older than the laws the court currently observed, a personal framework he had built from something he never fully described to her except in fragments. That a life given into your protection was a sacred charge. That the powerful must never use their power against those with less. That truth spoken plainly was worth more than any comfortable architecture of evasion. That an ancient vow once made was not circumstantial. She saw his darkness, and too, he did not pretend it away. He was a predator, had been for longer than recorded human history, and he carried within him the full weight of what that meant. She saw it in the court, in the way everyone around him, vampire nobles with centuries of their own history, still adjusted their behavior in his presence. She saw it the night a lesser lord of the court had spoken to her in a way that crossed a line she had not thought it necessary to articulate, because she had assumed the line was obvious. And Corvin had crossed the room in 3 steps and said 2 sentences in the old tongue that drained every bit of color from the lord's face and sent him backing toward the exit with his eyes cast down. She had asked Corvin afterward what he had said. "I explained the law," he said simply. "What law?" "The one that has governed my protection of you since the night I brought you here, that you are under my direct covenant. That to disrespect you is to disrespect the covenant. That the penalty is," he paused, selecting the word with care, "significant. You have a formal covenant protecting me. I established one on the 2nd day you were here." She stared at him. "You might have mentioned that. It was not intended to alarm you. It was intended to prevent exactly what occurred tonight. It didn't prevent it." "No," he said. "The lord in question is new to this court and had not been adequately briefed. He has been adequately briefed now." Something moved through his eyes. "Did he frighten you?" "No," she said honestly. "He annoyed me. I was going to handle it." "I know you were." A pause. "I was faster." She had looked at him for a long moment, then she had said, "Corvin, why did you really come to find me that night in the parking garage? I've been told the court's own physicians are not negligible. I've been told your connections to human medicine reach several respected research institutions. You had options." He held her gaze. "I had read your published work," he said, "your paper on unclassified organic toxins. The methodology was extraordinary. The thinking behind it was the kind that does not follow established paths because established paths are insufficient." He paused. "I needed someone who thought the way you think. Someone who would find a new answer where others had only found established ones. That's the professional reason." "Yes. Is there another one?" He looked at her steadily. "When I read your work," he said, "I understood the person who wrote it. The intelligence of it, yes, but also the care behind it. The genuine motivation to stop suffering, not to demonstrate capability or gain recognition, but because the work itself matters. Because people matter." He paused. "I have encountered that quality very rarely in 4 centuries. I recognized it. I wanted to meet the person who had it." Dahlia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That might be the most unexpectedly personal thing you have ever said to me." "You asked for the other reason," he said. "I did," she agreed, and she reached out and touched his hand where it rested at the edge of the desk, just briefly, just her fingers over his, and his hand had turned under hers and held on. It was the discovery of the betrayal that had brought them to the moment she had stepped between him and an assassin's blade. She had been reviewing a secondary compound, something she found in Valdris Terun's bloodwork 3 weeks after recovery that should not have been present, a trace residue suggesting the original poison had a companion formula, one intended not to kill but to suppress specific memory and perception functions in a recovering vampire. Someone had wanted the Regent alive but cognitively compromised, unable to accurately recall or identify what had happened to him. Unable to name who had ordered the poison, the compound was not naturally occurring. It required synthesis. It required access to the court's inner medical stores and the knowledge of exactly what the regent was being treated with. The list of people with that knowledge was shorter when she cross-referenced access logs and time of compound introduction than anyone comfortable. She had brought it to Corvin at midnight. She had watched his face go through the full arc of what a controlled, ancient, deeply honorable man looked like when he understood that the betrayal he had suspected was internal and specific and traced directly to someone within his own circle of trust. It was not rage. It was something worse than rage. It was the particular devastation of having your assessment of someone proved catastrophically wrong, and having that wrongness carry a price measured in the regent's suffering. "Tell me the name," he had said. She had. The evidence pointed to Casaveth Morn, second chair of the court's inner council, a vampire who had been part of the Blood Court for nearly as long as the court itself, who had all the right ancient vow credentials and all the hidden motive of someone who wanted the regent's seat and had run out of patience for waiting. Corvin had said, "I need to present this to the regent before Morn becomes aware we have it. Tonight." And they had gone together to the inner court chamber, which was where the ambush had been waiting, because Casaveth Morn had allies they had not yet uncovered, and one of those allies had been watching when Dahlia brought her evidence to Corvin, and someone had sent a message faster than they had moved. The assassin in Corvin's grip did not give up a name easily. He was court-trained and had the particular iron silence of someone who had calculated that loyalty was still safer than cooperation. Corvin held him against the stone and did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The quiet certainty of his authority was more compelling than volume. Eventually, the assassin said 2 words. "Morn sent me." "Under what instruction?" A pause. "Remove the sentinel, the healer, before they reach Therun." Corvin released him. He stepped back with a precision that might have looked like restraint from a distance, but that Dahlia recognized, from weeks of watching him, was a deliberate choice of method. He turned to his sentinels. "Secure him. Separate cell. No court access." He paused. "Tell no one of his capture. Tell no one we spoke." He looked at the ranking sentinel. "Morn's allies are not all known. Assume anyone could be compromised until I say otherwise." The sentinel's jaw tightened. "Understood." Corvin turned to Dahlia. The blood on his neck was a thin, dark line. She was already reaching for her bag. "I need to look at that," she said. "It is minor. I am the healer in this relationship. I determine what is minor." Something moved across his face. She noticed that she had said relationship without thinking, and that she had not taken it back. Neither had he. He sat on the stone bench she pushed him toward with a force that would have been comical against anyone else and let her clean and close the wound. The ash in the blade had delayed the natural clotting. She worked efficiently and carefully and did not let her hands shake, even though the tremor was there, underneath, the retroactive fear that had not been available to her during the confrontation but was very available now. "You stepped in front of the blade," he said. "Yes." "Dahlia," his voice was different, the court formal stripped out of it entirely. "You could have been killed. So could you. I regenerate, not instantly. And that blade was ash. I did my reading." She pressed a clean cloth against the wound and met his eyes from a proximity that was much closer than the last several weeks had ever required. "You were not going to survive ash through the throat, Corvin." He looked at her. The dark eyes were very close. She could feel the particular stillness he carried, which was not stillness at all, underneath, but absolute, complete attention. His entire focus landed on her, with a weight that was not frightening, but was, in its intensity, something she felt physically. "You were protecting me," he said, as though the concept was something he was processing from a significant distance. "Someone had to," she said. "Your sentinels were apparently 4 seconds behind the situation. That is being addressed as good." She sat back slightly. "The wound will close properly in about 20 minutes. Don't touch it." He caught her hand as she started to move back. Not hard, just his fingers around her wrist, the same grip from when they had both been facing the assassin, but different now. No urgency in it, just a refusal to let the distance increase. "I have guarded things I valued before," he said. "Objects, agreements, titles, the regent's line, the court's survival." He paused, a pause that was not uncertain but was looking for the exact shape of something true. "I have not in 4 centuries feared losing someone. Another pause. I feared losing you in that moment. When he had the blade at my throat and I understood that you intended to step between us, I feared what would happen if he moved the blade toward you. Dahlia looked at him. Her free hand was still on the cloth at his neck. Her other hand was still in his grip. Corvin, she said carefully, I am going to say something that may be inappropriate given that we are sitting in a court chamber immediately after an assassination attempt and there is a traitor on the inner council who still needs to be dealt with. Say it, he said. I prefer plain truth. I know you do. She looked at his face. The white hair, the dark eyes, the pale skin with its faint luminous quality. The old intelligence in his expression, and underneath it, the thing she had watched emerge slowly over 6 weeks, the quality she had not expected to find but could not now imagine having not found, the capacity to be seen. To let her see. I think I am in love with you, she said. I think I have been for some time, and I think you know that, and I think you have been waiting for me to say it first because that is the kind of man you are. The silence lasted 2 full seconds. The kind of man, he said. You know what I mean. He did. She could see that he did. And the thing that happened to his face was not the controlled reserve she had grown accustomed to reading in him. It was something that had not been presented to the open air in a very long time. Exposed, real, terrifyingly genuine. Casaveth Morn still needs to be confronted, he said. Yes, the Regent needs to be told. The court needs to be secured. There are 3 separate threads of investigation that require my direct attention in the next 4 hours. Also, yes, all of that is true, he said. Corvin, I have been in love with you, he said. Since the night you sat in a parking garage and asked me whether the Regent was dying in exactly the tone of someone who had already decided to fix it. Since you told me you were the kind of person who takes suffering personally. Since you sat in the library at 3 in the morning, reading a 400-year-old treatise and tried to explain regenerative matrix theory to me at the conclusion of a 12-hour day, and looked more alive doing it than most people I have met in 4 centuries looked at any point in their existence. He paused. I have been waiting. You are right. I was waiting because I would not presume. Because the choice had to be yours completely. Because I would not have it any other way. She leaned forward and kissed him. It was not a gentle kiss. She had too much adrenaline for gentle, and she suspected he had too much of whatever the vampire equivalent was. His hands came up and caught her face with a kind of desperate care, the way you hold something you thought you were about to lose, and she kissed him in the old stone chamber with the candles burning and the echo of a blade on marble still in the air, and she did not think about the traitor on the inner council, or the investigation, or the blood law, or the ancient complexity of what it meant to be this specific human in love with this specific vampire, and neither for those specific seconds did he. Then they pulled apart and looked at each other. Morn, she said. Yes, he agreed. They stood up. Getting to the Regent without Morn's remaining allies intercepting them required what Corvin called a secondary route and what Dahlia privately called the most unnerving 20 minutes of her life. Moving through passages in the court's underbelly that predated the current structure by 300 years and had the architectural quality of something that had been carved by people for whom aesthetics were secondary to the necessity of concealment. She stayed close to Corvin. He moved through the dark with the absolute ease of someone who did not require light, his hand at her back, guiding her through turns she could not see with a precision that never once let her stumble. They arrived at the Regent's private chambers through a passage behind the tapestry on the east wall. 2 of Corvin's most trusted sentinels were already stationed at the interior, not the usual guard rotation, his personal choices. Moved there in the 20 minutes after the chamber attack, Valdris Theroon looked up from his desk as they came through the wall. He was a great deal more formidable recovered than he had been ill. Silver-white hair, age-worn but powerful features, eyes that carried the exact weight of someone who had governed a vampire court for 300 years and found the experience educational. He looked at Corvin, then at Dahlia, then at the wound on Corvin's neck. How close, he said. Close enough, Corvin said. The evidence Dahlia has developed points to Casaveth Morn. The assassination attempt tonight confirms it. The compound she found in your blood work means the goal was not your death, but your ongoing cognitive compromise. You were to survive, Regent, but unable to clearly identify the source. Tharoon was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that 400 years of political patience produces. Then he said, I have known Casaveth Morn since he was still young enough to remember being human. I know, Corvin said. That does not excuse it, Tharoon said. It makes it worse. He looked at Dahlia. You found the secondary compound. It was in your recovery blood work, she said. A third of the concentration of the original poison, but a different formula entirely, targeted at memory encoding rather than physical regeneration. Whoever designed the original plan was thorough. They wanted you alive and confused. And controllable, Tharoon said. Yes. He stood. The full authority of the Regent of the Blood Court of the Undivided Realm settled into his frame the way it had been settling into that frame for centuries, natural and absolute. Call the inner council, he said to Corvin. All members. Inner chamber. I want Morn present. I want him to walk in not knowing that we know. Corvin said, the risk is mine to take. Tharoon said, call the council. Corvin had positioned Dahlia at the Regent's right. She had told him twice she was not part of the Blood Court and did not belong at the inner council. He had said, twice, that she had discovered the betrayal, she had developed the evidence, and her presence at the confrontation was both appropriate and important to what came next. The inner council chamber was smaller than the grand hall, high-ceilinged still but intimate in the way that power tends to concentrate itself into tighter spaces the more significant it becomes. 7 chairs, 7 members. Casaveth Morn arrived fourth. In the black and silver robes of his second chair position, white-haired and composed with the particular composure of someone who had done something terrible and had convinced themselves the justification was sufficient. He saw Dahlia. Something moved through his expression too quickly for a human observer to catch, but she was watching for it and she caught it. He sat down. The Regent addressed the council without preamble. He laid out, in sequential, undeniable order, every piece of evidence Dahlia had assembled. The compound identification, the access records, the timestamps, the financial trail she had found, with the help of one of Corvin's sentinels and 40 years of archived court records, connecting 3 separate transactions to an exterior laboratory that should not have existed. He presented it the way he had governed his court for 3 centuries, with the patience of someone who understood that truth presented completely, without exaggeration, without emotional manipulation, was the most devastating possible weapon. Morn listened. At some point during the presentation, all pretense of composure left his face, and what remained was the complicated wreckage of someone who had been absolutely certain of their cause, and was watching that certainty dissolve. The sentence under blood law, the Regent said at the conclusion, is exile from the court and the stripping of the vampire covenant. You will not belong to the undivided realm. You will not hold title, territory, or right of claim. You will live outside the court's protection for as long as you exist. He paused. Which, in exile, will likely not be long, Morn said. I wanted what was best for this court. I know, Tharoon said. That is the most tragic part of this. The council voted. It was 4-1, with 2 abstentions, both of whom Corvin noted were Morn's allies and would be investigated further. It was, for what it was, the cleanest possible application of an ancient, brutal law to a situation that had no clean resolution. When it was over, and Morn had been escorted out by sentinels who materialized with the quiet efficiency that Corvin had clearly arranged beforehand, the chamber let out a collective breath. Tharoon looked at Dahlia. You saved my life twice, he said. Once from the poison, once from the compromise it would have left me in. I was treating a patient, she said, and investigating an anomaly. That is what I do. And you stepped between my sentinel and a blade. She glanced at Corvin. He was bleeding, she said. I told him. That makes it my business. Tharoon looked between them for a moment. The ancient intelligence in his eyes did the kind of arithmetic that needed no explanation. The blood law, he said, allows a covenant of protection to be extended to a human in extraordinary circumstances. It has been done 3 times in the history of this court. He paused. It has not been done since 1782. Corvin said, Regent, I am not proposing anything, Tharoon said mildly. I am reciting historical fact, as I am entitled to do, being, among other things, the person who commissioned the historical record in question. His eyes held the kind of amusement that had been seasoned by centuries until it was very dry indeed. I will leave the application to your judgment. He rose. The court owes you a debt that the court does not easily acknowledge, Dahlia Fairchild. It is acknowledged. He left the chamber. They were alone. The candles burned low in their sconces. The old stone around them had absorbed 300 years of blood law and covenant, and terrible choices made by people trying to hold something worth holding together. Dahlia looked at the chair the Regent had occupied, and then at Corvin. "What is a covenant of protection for a human?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. "It is a formal declaration under blood law. It ties a vampire's honor directly to a human's safety. It is a binding vow, witnessed by the court, that designates the human as belonging to the covenant of the vampire who makes it." He paused. "Not a possession, an equal in law. Someone whose life, safety, and choices are protected under the same ancient codes as the vampire themselves." "It was done in 1782, she said. "A vampire lord and a human physician," he said, "in not entirely dissimilar circumstances. What happened to them?" "They were together," he said, "until the physician died, 83 years. The Lord did not take another covenant after. Some things, when they are real, do not replicate." He held her gaze. "I am not suggesting it because Therun suggested it. I am telling you it exists because you asked what it was. And I would rather explain it and have you refuse it than not explain it, and have you be unaware that such a thing was possible." Dahlia looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I asked you, weeks ago, whether staying had reasons that were not medical. You said it did." "Yes. I want you to understand something," she said. "I am not staying because of the covenant. I was not going to leave before the covenant came up. I am staying because of you, because of who you are, because the last 6 weeks have been the most fully myself I have ever been in this ancient, impossible, candlelit world, working on problems that no human has ever been positioned to solve, next to someone who treats my intelligence as an asset, and my safety as a priority, and my feelings as something worth waiting for." She stopped. "I am staying because I love you. The covenant is a question I need to think about. Not because I am not sure about you, but because I take formal vows seriously, and so do you, and I want it to mean what it is supposed to mean." He crossed the chamber in 3 steps. He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that the world between them was purely personal. "Think about it," he said. "Take whatever time you need. The answer you give me will be the right answer, whatever it is. And while I'm thinking about it, I will be here," he said. "Exactly where I have been." She reached up and touched his face, and the look that crossed it at her touch was something she thought she could spend a very long time making appear and never find it diminishing. "Your wound," she said. "I need to check it. It has closed. I determine what has closed." "Of course," he said, and the smile was there again, real and rare, and it was directed at her. The court required 2 more weeks to fully stabilize. The allies Morn had cultivated were identified one by one and given the opportunity to publicly restate their covenant to the Regent. The 2 who refused found themselves following Morn into exile, and the 3 who accepted were placed on a careful probationary record that Corvin maintained personally. The underground laboratory connected to the poison's external synthesis was traced to a decommissioned supply structure 3 levels below the main court, cleared out and sealed. Dahlia found 2 other members of Morn's network in the court medical stores and replaced the compromised supplies with her own verified compounds. She moved through all of it with the competence and clarity she brought to everything, and Corvin moved beside her, slightly ahead of her in rooms with multiple entry points, slightly behind her when she was working and needed space, and exactly level with her everywhere else. On the 17th day after the confrontation in the inner council chamber, she found the 1782 record. It was in the restricted archive, which she had been given access to weeks ago, and had simply not had time to explore fully. The court historian who managed the archive was a quietly brilliant vampire named Seraveth, who treated the records with the particular reverence of someone personally responsible for the fact that the past had not been lost. He found the relevant document and set it on the table in front of her without comment. It was handwritten on paper that had not deteriorated because the court's archive conditions were better than most national museums. The Covenant Declaration from 1782. 2 signatures, one in the angular formal script of the old vampire writing system, one in the looser cursive of a human hand. She read it twice. It was not a contract. It was a declaration. A statement of intent and honor and permanent commitment, made freely, witnessed by the court, and written in language that was so direct and so old-world, and so entirely devoid of evasion that it made several things she had been trying to think clearly about suddenly very clear. She brought it to Corvin that evening. He looked at it in her hands, and then at her face. "I have been thinking," she said. "Yes," he said, "the covenant. Yes. I want to do it," she said. "I want to make it formal. Not because it changes anything for me personally, because I have already decided about you, but because I think it matters in this world. I think it matters that it is said plainly and witnessed and written down. Because you take ancient vows seriously, and I take formal commitments seriously, and we are both people who believe that the things we mean should be said out loud in front of witnesses." He looked at her with the full weight of 4 centuries of living, and underneath that, something much younger. Something that had been waiting much longer than 4 centuries, probably, for the exact person who would say exactly those words. "Dahlia," he said, "are you certain?" "I prefer plain truth," she said. "You taught me that. I taught you nothing," he said. "You already knew it, then we agree," she said. "Are we doing this?" He held out his hand. She took it. The covenant was made 3 days later in the Grand Hall, before the full court, before the Regent, before every silver-eyed, white-haired ancient being who occupied the blood court of the undivided realm. It was witnessed by Serevith the archivist and by 2 senior court lords who had been among the regents most trusted for long enough that their signatures carried the weight of institutional memory. Dahlia wore a deep blue dress that one of the court's attendants had somehow produced in 48 hours, and that fit with suspicious perfection, and she stood in the candlelit hall with her spine straight and her hands steady, and looked at Corvin Rosencrux, who stood in formal court black, with the silver crest of his sentinel office at his collar and his white hair and his dark eyes, and the 4 centuries behind him, and the deliberate, chosen present he was giving her. And she said the declaration out loud in a clear voice. She declared herself willing. She declared herself aware. She declared herself choosing, with full knowledge of what the covenant meant, and what it bound and what it committed. Because she was Dahlia Fairchild, a woman who had spent her adult life walking into rooms full of suffering and choosing to help, not because it was required of her, but because she could not imagine being the kind of person who would not, and Corvin Rosencrux was the first person she had ever met who loved her for exactly that quality without once suggesting she moderate it. Corvin made his declaration in both the old tongue and in English, because, he said quietly to her before they began, the old tongue was for the court, and English was for her specifically. In English, he said, "I bind my protection to your life. I bind my honor to your choices. I bind my name to your safety, and my presence to your well-being for as long as you will have it, and I offer this not as ownership but as devotion, freely given, held open, yours to take or return as you see fit, and constant regardless of what you choose." She had not expected to have to work quite so hard not to cry. She managed it, mostly. The Regent presented the signed and witnessed document with a gravity that was appropriate to the occasion, and a warmth in his expression that he would have denied in any formal review of the evening. Afterward, the court did what courts do, assembled in the Grand Hall with more animation than the occasion strictly required, because an ancient vampire covenant was rare and the court was also, underneath all its politics and blood law and immortal weight, a community of people who understood better than most the significance of choosing, deliberately, someone to stand beside. Corvin found her at the edge of the hall, holding a glass of something the court's kitchen had sourced specifically for her palate, and thinking the kind of private thoughts that show on a person's face when they do not realize they are smiling. "You are pleased," he said. "I am," she said. "Are you?" He looked at her. The candlelight did what it always did. The court murmured and moved behind him. He was utterly still in it, as though the room existed around the specific point where he stood with her. "I have lived," he said, "long enough to know when something is rare, long enough to have learned not to undervalue it when it appears." He paused. "I am not merely pleased. I am grateful in a way I did not expect to be capable of being. I would like you to know that." She set down her glass and took his hand. You said, in the parking garage, that you'd read my paper on unclassified toxins and understood the person who wrote it. Do you remember that? Perfectly. I want you to understand something about the person who wrote it, she said. She does not do anything halfway. She does not commit to things she does not mean. She does not say things to be kind when the truth would serve better. She looked up at him. When I tell you I love you, it is not the beginning of that feeling. It is the word I have been looking for 6 weeks to describe something that was already complete. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When you stepped between me and the blade." Yes. I understood in that moment, he said, that there is a kind of strength I had not encountered before. Not physical, not supernatural. The kind that moves without hesitation in the direction of the thing it loves, regardless of what it costs. He raised her hand and held it against his chest, over a heart that beat slower than hers and had been beating for a very long time. You came to this court to save the Regent. You ended by saving me. He paused. I was not aware until recently that I needed saving. You didn't, she said. You needed finding. There's a difference. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, I have been thinking about the library. The change of subject was so unexpected, it made her laugh. The library. I want to commission a full new section, specifically for the intersection of human and vampire medical science. The work you have done here has implications that no one has yet mapped. The court's physicians, with your guidance, could develop an entirely new field of practice. There is, I think, a great deal that each side has been unable to learn without the other. He paused. I would like you to lead it if you want to. She stared at him. You want me to build a new medical research division for the blood court, with full resources, full library access. The equipment you need. He paused. The coffee situation has been permanently addressed. It has, she confirmed. The court's kitchen had, 2 weeks ago, begun producing coffee that was genuinely excellent, which she had decided not to examine too closely. And, he said, it would give you a reason to stay that is not only me. I want you here because you want to be here, because it is the right place for you, and not only because it is the place I am. She looked at him, this man, this ancient, complicated, white-haired, deeply honorable, slightly infuriating, irreplaceable man. Corvin, she said, you are also a reason, an important one. You don't need to find me professional justifications, I know, he said, but I want you to have everything, not only one thing. That was the quality she had tried to name in the parking garage and had not had the right word for yet. The particular combination of fierceness and tenderness that he directed at her. Protective without being controlling, devoted without being possessive, certain of what he wanted, without ever requiring that certainty to override what she wanted. I'll build your medical research division, she said. Our medical research division, he said. The covenant makes certain terms communal, does it? The old tongue is very specific. She shook her head, but the smile was there, and she let it be there, and he looked at it with the specific expression of someone who had, after 4 centuries, finally stopped being a tourist in happiness and arrived. The months that followed were the kind that do not make dramatic stories but make lives. She built the research division. She hired 2 human researchers, both specialists in their fields, who came to the court through channels that required careful management of human-vampire boundary protocols, and who arrived in the underground complex with the deer-in-headlights expression she remembered having in the parking garage, and which she now recognized as the specific look of someone whose world has just become significantly larger than anticipated. She mentored them. She built the library section with Sereveth's enthusiastic collaboration, because Sereveth turned out to have been quietly hoping for exactly this for approximately 200 years, and had a list of acquisition targets that he produced from a drawer with the speed of someone who had prepared for this moment. She treated court members who came to her with medical concerns that their own physicians had not been able to address. She developed 2 new compounds that emerged directly from the intersection of vampire physiology and human pharmacology. She published a carefully anonymized version of the first compound's methodology in a human medical journal, a man under a pseudonym, and the peer reviewers called it a significant advance in cellular regeneration theory, which it absolutely was, because she had done the underlying research on actual immortal cellular structures. She went to the surface regularly. She kept her human life in the ways that mattered, her professional license, her contact with colleagues, her morning coffee from her favorite corner shop when she needed above-ground air and sunlight. She came back in the evenings, which was when the court was most alive anyway, and the guard at the elevator who checked the blood key panel had eventually stopped, looking surprised to see her, and begun nodding with the familiarity of routine. Corvin was present for all of it, as he had said he would be. Present in the way that meant available, not constant. He had his own responsibilities, the court's security, the sentinel function that was his ancient charge, the ongoing management of the aftermath of Morn's exile, and the rehabilitation of the court's inner council. He was occupied. He was not absent. He was there in the evenings when she came back. He was there when she worked late and needed someone to tell her she had been sitting at the desk for 6 hours without eating. He was there when she had a difficult case and needed to work through the problem out loud at someone who would listen without offering solutions she had already considered. He was there in the way that Corvin Rosencrux was always there, fully and deliberately, and with the particular quality of presence that she had realized. Sometime around month 3, she had been looking for her entire life without knowing what to call it. She called it home now. One night, almost a year after the parking garage, they were in the library at a reasonable hour for once, which was before midnight, and she had finished the paper she was reviewing, and he had finished the security assessment he was annotating, and they were sitting in the comfortable silence that had become one of her favorite things about their life. Together, the kind of silence that does not need to be filled, because the presence filling it is sufficient. She said, "I want to tell you something." He looked up. "I want to tell you that this is not what I expected my life to look like." He waited. "I expected a very good career and a reasonable amount of personal satisfaction and occasional brilliant work, and a life that was mine and comfortable and full of things I had built myself." She paused. "I did not expect underground courts or ancient vampires, or blood law or poison investigations, or a covenant declared in front of 300 people who have collectively lived for approximately 40,000 years. She looked at him. "I am telling you this not as a complaint. I am telling you this because I want you to know that it is better. That what I actually got is so much larger and stranger and more extraordinary than what I had planned for, and that you are the center of it." He set down his assessment. "Dahlia," he said. "You don't need to say anything," she said. "I just wanted you to know." "I do need to say something," he said. "I have been deciding how to say it for several months." She waited. "In 4 centuries," he said, "I have seen a great deal of what human beings are capable of. I have watched civilizations cycle through rise and fall. I have watched the same political mistakes made with slightly different costumes in every century. I have watched the same cruelties, the same generosities, the same vast and complicated range of what it means to be alive." He paused. "I have not grown cynical of it. That is perhaps surprising. But I have grown certain, over time, that some things are genuinely rare." He held her gaze. "You are genuinely rare. Not your intelligence, though that is extraordinary. Not your skill, though I would trust it with my life and have the quality underneath those things. The way you move toward what needs doing without requiring it to be safe first. The way you are honest about what you feel. The way you arrived in a parking garage after a 14-hour shift and asked whether the Regent was dying in the tone of someone already halfway to the solution." He paused again. "I fell in love with you in that parking garage. I have been falling further every day since." She looked at him across the library. The candles, the books, the stone walls, the 4 centuries behind him, and the whole particular impossible beautiful existence of this world she had walked into and made her own. "4 centuries," she said, "and you waited this long." "Some things," he said, "are worth the wait." She crossed the room. He stood to meet her. And when she put her arms around him, he held her with the particular care of someone who understood completely what he was holding and had chosen, with full knowledge and full intention, to hold it as long as he was allowed. Outside the library, the court of the blood court of the undivided realm moved through its ancient rhythms. The sentinels rotated, the candles burned. The archive continued its patient accumulation of records that no one above ground would ever read. The Regent, recovered and governing, met with his inner council in a chamber that had been witness to betrayal and its reckoning, and was now witness something steadier. And in the library, a human healer who had walked into the dark without hesitation, and a vampire guardian who had stood between danger and the world for 4 centuries, held onto each other in the candlelight. And the distance between what they had been separately and what they were together was the exact distance between a life that was good and a life that was fully, completely, against all probability, alive. The ancient vow was made. The betrayal was past, the court was whole. The wound had closed, as she had always known it would, because that was what wounds did when they were properly treated, and given time and care and the steady presence of someone who refused to leave them unattended. Dahlia Fairchild had come to the blood court to save a life. She had saved several. Corvin Rosencrux had come to a parking garage to bring back a healer. He had found something he had not been looking for, which was the thing he had been missing for 400 years, which was someone who looked at all of him, the danger and the grace, the ancient power and the hidden capacity for warmth, the dominant certainty and the deliberate tenderness, and chose him, completely and without reservation, and on her own terms. He had spent 4 centuries protecting things. For the first time in all of those centuries, something was protecting him back. And in the library of the blood court, with the candles burning low and the ancient books on their shelves and the whole old world resting around them, like a cathedral that had learned to live underground, that was enough. It was in fact everything.